Welcome to this webinar. I'm Henrik Kramberg Iversen. I'm the leader of our consumer market here in the Nordic in EY. And as most of you know, we host these webinars every second Thursday from 8 to 8:30. Today we have a highly relevant topic which I've been looking forward to, looking into the megatrends and the climate and how that actually impacts the supply chain with a special focus on the consumer sector. I'm pleased to be joined by my three colleagues, Hanne, Dan and Yvonne, who will take you through this. So without further delay, let me hand over to you, Hanne, and take us through it. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Henrik. Yes, so I will just introduce our team and also our two presenters. And do we have a slide? Have a slide to quickly present our team. So I'm Hanne Thornam, and I'm a partner and leader of the Norwegian Climate Change and Sustainability Services team. And we are a multidisciplinary team that is focused on understanding the risks and opportunities that arise from climate change and sustainability issues. So a team that solely focuses on these topics. And by now we're more than 1,000 consultants globally and growing quickly. And in the Nordics, we're more than 40 consultants. And I have with me two of my superstars, Jakob Wangen, who is the senior manager in our team, and he's an environmental engineer. And he's focused or specialized in helping companies with their sustainability strategies, very often taking them from scratch to sustainability integrated in the main strategy, or for more mature companies, helping them to understand their climate risks and opportunities, and taking on this new challenge and opportunity. And he's also worked quite a lot with the retail and consumer business, and a lot with food and forestry in particular, actually. And we also have Yvonne, who's a senior consultant in our team, and she's a geologist by training. Sorry. Geologist with a master's in climate change. And she's also specialized in sustainability strategy and climate risk, and also quite a lot on sustainable finance. And she's also been part of a survey that we've done on climate change and sustainability in the retail sector in particular, that she will show you some findings from. So I'll leave it over to you, Dan, to take it away.
Thank you. It's not a bad introduction on a Thursday morning at 8 o'clock. Thank you for that. So today we're going to talk a little bit about the megatrends, and then we're going to deep dive a little bit into climate risk and kind of how this impacts into the supply chain and value chain. But first, let's take the big picture. So megatrends are a way of understanding disruption. It's a way of understanding what are the primary forces driving disruption, and also kind of a framework we can use to understand how disruption will affect the industry. So EY has done a report that's actually quite good, that shows some explanation of what are the primary forces and what are the megatrends. The primary forces is technology, demographics, globalization, and environment. And today we're going to focus on environment, but it's important to kind of consider that changes in environment and changes in climate change affects climate, technology, demographics, and globalization. So these are all intertwined. And if we look on the megatrends kind of one step further, decarbonization, of course, is a natural topic here, but also synthetic media, meaning kind of fake news, trust in data, trust in companies, work-life unbounded, as I'm an example of, sitting here on my home office as of today. And apologies, my dog is apparently making a little bit of a fuss behind me. And all of these are kind of a way of understanding potential future scenarios. And that's what climate risk is all about, understanding what are potential future scenarios. So let's deep dive into this with kind of our sustainability lenses on and look a little bit at what are the main challenges, what is happening out there, and what are the main drivers. So first and foremost, what you see here is a picture of global average temperature from about the Industrial Revolution until today. So blue means that it's below global average temperature, and red means that you're above global average temperature. And as can be clearly seen that we're in a exponential growth kind of on the global average temperatures, where the last couple of decades we've seen really a significant change. And what the IPCC tells us is that we have less than 10 years to cut more than 45% of our greenhouse gas emissions to have a 66% chance of staying below 1.5 degrees. So there's a significant amount of work that needs to be done both by industry and society to be able to do this. But this is one of the major challenges that faces all industries and all sectors the next couple of 10 years. But it's not only kind of global warming that's an issue with climate change. We also have an issue with biological diversity. Actually, 50% of biological diversity has disappeared in the last 40 years. And shockingly enough, only 4% of mammals are today wild. So that means that our pets, our farm animals and human beings actually are 96% of all mammals on Earth, at least on a weight by weight basis. That's a shocking figure when you start thinking about it. And this year we've also had additional challenges with COVID-19 kind of making the picture even more difficult and difficult. And COVID-19 have led to an increase in global poverty for the first time in decades. And over 70 million people was forced into extreme poverty in 2020, giving new types of risks in the supply chain and really challenging how we work with suppliers in at least countries where this is a large risk. But we also see not only these kind of global trends, we also see regulatory changes. The EU has launched the European Green Deal, where the Circular Economy Action Plan is one of the parts there. And I think the Circular Economy Action Plan will really be a driver for change the next couple of years, especially now going towards 2030, 2035. The Circular Economy Action Plan is more of a framework that outlines what regulation we can expect in the future, and as of today are not very specific on certain areas. But what we see today is it has a ban on single use of plastic, which of course affects a lot of consumer companies. You also have a material recycling goal that is transferred onto nations. So in 2035, 65% of all waste or municipal-like waste that is produced needs to be material recycled. In Norway, a country you would think are quite kind of leading on this, is only at 40%. So this kind of leads on to the next point there, extended producer responsibility. It's a topic that's raised in the Circular Economy Action Plan, but not really detailed. I think that there will be new regulations and new detailing of what this actually means in the next year or two or three, where you can see that companies are actually been made responsible for what happens with the product at the end of life. So is your product repairable? Can it be reused? Can it be recycled? How do you design for that in your design phase? I think all of this will really affect how we think of consumer products. One example being, for example, the Apple iPhone. Will Apple be allowed to sell an iPhone on the European market that's glued together, not easily repairable, and has a charger that's only suited for that model? things like this, I think the European Commission could easily start making regulations on. And the EU is not only regulating and trying to regulate the companies themselves, they've also started regulating the finance and the capital. So the EU has an overall ambition of moving 1,000 billion euros into green activities by 2030. And 1,000 billion euros, that's like a fantastillion amounts of money. 1,000 billion is the same amount that we have in the Norwegian sovereign wealth fund. How they aim to do that is that they've developed something called an EU taxonomy. A taxonomy is a definition or a framework for defining kind of or in biology is defining what a species is, but here it's defining what a sustainable economic activity is. And it's quite detailed. It has thousands of pages of detailed description of what is a sustainable building industry, what is a sustainable forestry product, what is a sustainable server park, etc., etc. And the thing is with this is that it's quite strict already. It's quite few activities that actually fall within the criteria. And they plan to increase and kind of make it more and more difficult as the years pass to kind of get within that framework of what is green. So we've seen the start this year with money moving into green companies, green stocks, green bonds. I think on the Norwegian Stock Exchange, I read that in September, the green stocks had increased with 56% with the start of the year. I really think that this is only the start of a larger trend that we'll see across many markets and sectors. And finally, of course, we can't talk about the consumer sector without talking about the consumer. COVID-19 has done some significant changes in how we look at the market. EY does a quite cool survey that's called EY Future Consumer Index. And there's a lot of insight that's coming out regularly from there. So I recommend you to have a look at that when you're doing kind of your internal work in your organization. And one of the results that was launched this summer was that 50% of people in our survey replied that they've reduced their physical shopping. 35% have changed what they shop. And I think finally, a very interesting from a sustainability perspective is 53% believes that their values and how they view the world will change. And what this really means is that consumers are now more open to change than kind of what they maybe were before COVID-19. And this is really a golden opportunity to test new solutions and try new things. And really not utilizing that opportunity is a risk, considering that your competitors and others in the market may be actually taking that chance. So it's a good kind of perspective taking in when you're thinking about the changes that could be done in both supply chain and within your own company. So next, Yvonne is going to talk a little bit about a survey we did in the Nordics in the consumer sector this summer on climate risk in the supply chain. So Yvonne, take it away.
Thank you, and good morning, everyone. I'm going to tell you about the survey that we did in preparation for Ethical Trade Norway and their conference previously this fall. And if we skip to next slide, I'm going to tell you that for this survey, we wanted to dig a bit deeper into the topic of climate change and global supply chains. And we conducted a survey specifically on the retail and consumer product sector in the Nordics, where we received 21 replies, perhaps also a corona condition for this outcome. But what we wanted to find out was to which degrees companies today work with establishing climate robust supply chains. And in the next slides, I will share some of our learnings. But first, if we go back once, I want to tell you a bit about what we think about when we say climate robust supply chains. From the picture, you can see that one aspect of it, and perhaps the one that most naturally come to mind, is resilience. That this is something that all companies think of to be more resilient to handle shock and to make sure that they have stable deliveries. But we also think it's about responsibility to your existing suppliers and to cooperate with them to meet the challenges that climate change brings and playing each other good. So for us, climate robust supply chain means not just being forced to change suppliers as an effect of unforeseen risk due to climate change, but to have those risks firmly on the radar and actively working to mitigate those. So going through some of our findings, we see on here, companies have strategies in place that address climate in the supply chains, but only few have set targets. Here we see that 10 out of 21 companies state to have a supplier strategy that addresses climate, but within those, only 6 specifically address greenhouse gas emissions, for example. Furthermore, we see that 6 have targets, but only 2 have enough control to say something about the quantitative targets that they would like to set. And this is something that builds on previous surveys that we see on supply chain management, is that they're often more general and refer to large themes such as climate and environment, and to a less degree, more specific sector challenges. Furthermore, we see that on the next slide, the majority considers how supply chains contribute to climate change. As Don mentioned, there's a huge dugnad that needs to be done in terms of reducing our climate change emission to go into to reach the climate change targets. However, we see that the companies thinking that they need to reduce their own climate change emissions have been the focus for the longest time and the more sole focus. So this is also something that we see have become more standard reporting in corporate disclosures, their negative effect on the environment and climate. If we move on to the next slide, we see that if we turn that arrow, we see that there's far less maturity in considering to which degree the supply chain itself is exposed to climate change, which can be physical risks through extreme weather that's happening increasingly and damages the supplies or disrupts the deliveries. But they can also be transition risks, such as CO2 regulations having an effect on international trade. Here we see that the people or the companies prepared are much less than the previous picture. Only 5 consider and maps which types of climate risks the supply chain is exposed to. And when combining this with the finding that only 6 out of 21 works with enhancing suppliers' resilience, a picture starts to materialize showing that companies to a low degree are prepared to the challenges posed by climate change, which is something that we really need to get into. So the survey shows that companies work with reducing their own negative contributions, but this has also been traditionally referred to as more reputational risks. So we ask, what about going to work more actively with your suppliers to increase their resilience to climate change through mitigative efforts, in the same way that companies had previously and continuously works with suppliers to improve workers' conditions and workers' rights by being an active procurer, going into dialogue. This does not seem, though, to be as maturely set on the company's agenda when considering climate change, which is why we see a need for climate risk to become a more prominent part of companies' agenda when also thinking about their supply chain management. And that's our results. And Don will go through a bit more into what constitutes climate risks now.
Thank you, Yvonne. So what Yvonne is really saying is that, yes, a lot of companies started to think of, okay, how do we impact climate change in our supply chain, but hasn't really taken into account the climate risk that they're exposed to. So what is climate risk? Yvonne was introducing it quickly, but with the physical risk and the transitional risk. So the physical risk, as Yvonne said, is yes, extreme weather, but it's also flooding, it's drought, it's more rain, more precipitation, hotter, colder. It's the physical kind of weather and climate that's changing. And on the other side, we have that transitional risk. And transitional risk is the consequences of society changing to meet and adapt to those physical changes. So we have in this graph below here a kind of a illustration of how physical risk and transitional risk are intertwined. So in the number one there is an illustration of a low emission scenario. So that's a scenario where we manage to meet the ambitions of the Paris Agreement, so 2 to 1.5 degree target. There we will have a large amount of societal changes with regulations, CO2 pricing, changes in consumer demands, transportation, logistics, etc. But we will limit the physical impact, so the amount of global warming will be limited. Well, if we jump on the other side and look at the other extreme, so a world in complete climate chaos, global corporation falls apart, UN can't work, the IPCC maybe is dissolved, who knows. On that side, we will have limited amounts of regulation, limited changes in how we do business, and we continue more or less as we do, but maybe even to a more extreme degree with climate impact. There we will have limited transitional risk, but the global warming levels will be significant, and you will have more drought, more flooding, more extreme weather, and so on. And the point here being is that we're trying to predict the future. And I don't know about you guys, but I'm at least confident to know that I can't do it, because there's so many factors that's out there that's affecting what the outcome will be. So when thinking about climate risk, we need to think about different scenarios and take those into account in our risk planning. Next here, I thought I could give some kind of perspective on climate risk and the effect that it could really have on your supply chains. The first picture here is a map showing the vulnerability of different countries to climate change. So vulnerability meaning how much physical climate risk do you expect that country to have? And what is their adaptability and their agileness, if that's a word? How agile are they to meet those changes? And the sad picture, of course, is that the global south is much more exposed due to both the physical nature of where the country is located, but also with regards to their capacity to accommodate these changes. And if we look at a 3.5 degree temperature increase, which is a business as usual scenario, we would see that we would have an impact of 17% reduction of world crops. So these are not small risks. These are major global food security type of risks that could almost create wars and cold wars and really shift how the consumer market and the supply chains work. Some other facts that we could look at is on coffee, which is one of the extreme ones, where it's estimated that about 43% of existing land used for coffee growth in 2050 will not be suitable, even reaching a 1.5 degree target. And 250 million people are expected, or at least it's a conservative estimation by the UN, will be displaced by 2050 due to extreme weather conditions, dwindling water reserves, or degradation of agricultural land. So again, it's not only affecting the pure physical parts of it, it's also a social side to the climate change. And I think it's important here to consider what type of consumer industry you're within, because specific industries have specific challenges. Here is one example from the fashion industry, which is the second largest consumer of water worldwide. And the picture here you see is of the Aral Sea in Uzbekistan, which used to be the fourth largest lake in the world, is now completely more or less gone. And there's only a few ponds and toxic waste left. And this is because overconsumption from cotton farms that's overconsume water, not considering the planetary boundaries that they're operating within. So I thought we could kind of finish this part with what can we learn from how companies handle COVID-19. So COVID-19 was a similar situation to what we're discussing here. Suddenly, abruptly, we experienced disruption in deliveries. So you could think of different approaches to how to handle this. One would be relying on your risk evaluations, using your risk framework, and taking decisions based on that. You could put on more resources, work with your supply chain to ensure that those deliveries come to ground or are delivered. I think a lot of companies did it, but I think the main strategy that we saw was companies looking for new types of suppliers. And of course, this is a short-term solution that solves the immediate demand or issue that you have, but it doesn't really solve the long-term issue with climate risk and the responsibility of reducing impacts into your supply chain. Because if you're going to deliver more value to your consumers, you need to be able to deliver a more climate effective or more sustainable product to your consumers. And how do you do that? You can't just rebrand existing products with existing technology. You need to really go into your supply chain. And I think the way to do that is cooperating with your suppliers. And just adding on new suppliers every time you get a new challenge is not the long-term solutions to handling these issues. So I think looking at risk evaluation, more resources is something that needs to be balanced out with the actions that we saw now in COVID-19. So to wrap this a little bit up, I'm going to present a little step-by-step guide on at least how we in EY approach climate robustness and how to enhance that. I won't go into detail on this, and if you're interested, we can send out slides at the end of this session, where we can have a little bit more detailed information on each different step, so you can read this if you're interested. So, what really it all starts about is our defining kind of what are the scenarios? How do we think the future may look? And that's looking at different levels of temperature, different types of response from society, and identifying what are my risks and opportunities within those different scenarios. In the low emission scenarios, maybe it's a huge risk that you have high transport costs. In a high global warming scenario, maybe it's the risk of flooding disrupting your deliveries. The next part is understanding how and where do these risks and opportunities impact our value chain. Where in our value chain? Is it in our first steps? Is it in logistics? Is it in our production? Is it in our deliveries? Is it in our consumer part? Next, it's understanding and quantifying these risks and opportunities. And then it's implementing measures to reduce reduce and manage those risks. And finally, it's the monitoring and reporting on that. So that's thinking, okay, how can I make a dashboard for my management group? What are the KPIs? Is it diesel price, diesel consumption? Is it number of rain days in our production countries? It's really a lot of creative KPIs that are not usually in board reports and management reports, but these are something that could state something about the urgency of the situation and how it changes over time. In addition to this, there is a framework called TCFD, Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, which I've not talked about today, but it's a major framework really talking about how to handle this. And implementing and managing according to it and reporting according to that as well is something that will be expected from a lot of your external stakeholders, including your financial communities. So, that was more or less the content that we had today. So I hope that you sit kind of with an impression that climate risk is not only the environmental box that we're talking about in the megatrends. It also affects globalization. It affects demographics. It affects technology, and it's kind of a company-wide risk. I believe next time you're going to talk about some of the technologies that can be used in managing climate risk, which is blockchain. So the kind of technology part of that. I work with blockchain and sustainability in the fashion industry, and I think it's a super cool example of how to actually take this into practice. So that was everything from us. So more or less right on time.
But thank you, Dan and Yvonne. Highly impressive what you have, and also making a little more practical on what to think about for taking the next steps. If there is an urgent question, one or two, I think we can make room for that, or else we will of course do the recording and make certain that it's shared on our YouTube channel for people to watch if you want everybody to share it. And then also please reach out to the team. They have some strong credentials and they have practical experience in how to drive this forward in creating significant benefit for the companies that they've been working with. So if there's any questions, please let us know, or else we will take them afterwards with you individually. But for me, Dan, Yvonne, and Hanne, thanks a lot. Impressive what you're doing in the team, and always a pleasure to hear about these very important things for our common future.
Thanks, Henrik.